Thank you, everyone, for joining us. We are doing a special edition of the Mythicist Milwaukee show today. Just so for the audience sake, we just held a debate between Dr. Robert Price and Dr. Bart Ehrman on whether or not Jesus existed. This is a debate that people have kind of been waiting for, and we were really excited and honored to be able to hold it in Milwaukee at Turner Hall. I just wanted to cover some stats, and today we are joined by Matt Dillahunty, Richard Carrier, David Fitzgerald, and Kristyn Whitaker Hood. We're going to get their feedback on the debate. I know a lot of people have been talking about the debate, and Jason's here as well. I'm sorry, Jason. You're here. Hello. So a lot of people have been talking about the debate. We've seen a lot of video responses to it. We've seen, just within Milwaukee, we had people come to our meetings afterwards talking about it. So definitely is of interest to people. So I just want to share some stats quickly. We did have 286 people in the seats in Milwaukee live for the event. And then online, we had sold about 210 tickets, which we ended up finding out because of Kling and what we use. It was more like 1,000 people watched it online. But we received about 70 surveys, and we asked the people before the debate, did you feel that Jesus existed? And we had about a 46% rate of they didn't feel that Jesus existed. And then after the debate, that actually moved up, unfortunately, to 51% people
that did.
Yeah, so if you're going to take that small sample, and that small sample, it looks like the Bart Ehrman did what he came to do and change some minds. We did have people in 18 countries and 15 states just based on the survey, and the online stats that we saw was much greater than that. So we're going to start it. We're just going to hand it off to the professionals. We've had a lot of layman's talking about this. But we kind of want to hear what the professionals'
So what's
feedback
going
is.
on right now if people want to view the debate?
Thank you, Jason.
What should they do?
The debate is up, and we are renting it out on YouTube. So you can go to the mythicistmilwaukee.com to find that video. Like I said, unfortunately, we do have to rent it because this was a very expensive event to put on, and unfortunately, we didn't make back what we needed. So, you're renting the video really helps us continue to bring these types of events to Milwaukee and the nation. We are for hire. If anyone out there wants to hold an event like this, let us know. Yeah, so we want to get the professional feedback from everyone. So we're going to start with Matt Dillahunty. Matt, what did you think about the debate?
Hey, well, I can keep my comments relatively short. The day after the debate, I went to Kansas for a convention, and the talk that I gave the day, I called it Skepticism in the Historical Jesus, and I already posted up, and it's live to everybody. So a lot of my thoughts about the debate are there, but the quick summary is, before we started, I was pretty much, I was kind of non-committal. I was maybe leaning a little bit more towards historicity. As the moderator, I figured I would have the best seat in the house, but as it turns out, the audio was pointed towards the audience, as it should be. And so there were some things that I didn't hear very clearly sitting up there. But by the time the debate was over, I think that irrespective of the facts and the merits of the case, if you were to look at, it was clear to me that Ehrman did a much better job. That's completely separate from whether or not he, made his case on the merits. I, at the end of the debate, was more swayed towards the idea that Jesus did exist as a historical figure. But I'm not completely sold. And the conclusion of the video that I posted, which deserves a correction, was that I said mythicism is not ready for prime time. What I should have said is, based on this debate alone, one could conclude that, mythicism isn't ready for prime time, because I think that there are almost certainly people who would have done a much better job and perhaps even swayed me more towards a mythicist position than Price did. I think my biggest problems, one was time management. Not only did he hit his 30-minute opening and wasn't finished, but during the 2 10-minute periods where he was allowed to ask questions of Ehrman, his first period, he stopped asking questions with about 3.5 minutes left. And his second 10-minute period, he stopped with over 8 minutes left. So, he used a minute and a half of his question time. And there was a moment where Bart laughed at him because Bob had said that none of Paul's writings were by Paul. And I think that kind of wounded him and set him off, and he put his mic down and he was kind of done. And there was a lot of kind of phoning it in. Now, I've known Bob for years and liked him and was a little concerned that I would be too biased his direction before the debate. But I don't know exactly what was going through his mind, but I think there was some really good information and a really good kind of maybe intro to mythicism, but a lot of it just, I think they talked over people's heads on occasion, and then Bob shut down and, and basically said he doesn't care what people believe. And I don't know how you can be in the right mindset to do a debate while simultaneously saying, hey, this is just what I think. I'm not trying to convince anybody, because that to me is the purpose of debates. But I don't think it was remotely a waste of time. I enjoyed doing it. I commented on how, in the video that's up on my channel, on how I'd like to see more of this and more debates. And actually, I talked to Dr. Carrier about another debate in Houston coming up in the near future. We may be able to work something out. But I definitely enjoyed it. It was not as... I don't think the mythicist side was nearly as well represented as it probably deserved to be. And I don't want to necessarily fault Bob for that, because I don't know what all was going on. But that's my takeaway.
Excellent. Kristyn, what are your thoughts?
Oh, well, I agree with Matt on that. The presentation was better done by Dr. Ehrman. I think he was a little more on point with what he had to say, and he managed his time well. I think this was a learning curve for us. I think if we had it to do over again, I would probably want it to be a little more specific. Maybe we could have kept it more to the minimal Doherty thesis, so he couldn't have taken advantage of the Renee Psalm going into whether Nazareth existed or that type of thing, which is a way of sort of diverting from the main point about Jesus. He starts going off into, what Renee Psalm thinks about it. And I'm sitting here thinking, well, you're debating Robert Price. Why are you going off into, to that topic? And, but the average person doesn't know that. They don't necessarily know who, Renee Psalm is versus Bob Price. So I think if we had it to do over again, it would be better to kind of narrow our focus of a debate onto a specific area, or something like that, where we're just debating the Doherty thesis or something, the minimal Doherty thesis, where we can keep it very specific. It might be a little bit easier to judge, so they can't pull in the opposite side can't pull in maybe some of the more fringe theories from mythicists. So I think that would be something we might take out of that. I do think Dr. Ehrman had a better presentation, but I still don't. I don't agree with. I read Did Jesus Exist? And I don't agree with I feel like he diverts a lot from what mythicists are saying. I still feel like he was still doing that, the debate, like where he was going off with Nazareth issue with Renee Psalm's points, where it really wasn't necessary. So I do think that's something that we could take away, maybe keep it a little more specific in the future.
Excellent. David?
Yeah, I agree with both of those two. My biggest takeaways from the debate was, first of all, it was refreshingly civil for somebody like Ehrman and Price. Normally, we don't see that level of civility right from the get-go. I did think it broke down in places, and like Matt pointed out, Price just seemed to want to take his ball and go home. And I was very disappointed from that bit. But my biggest disappointment with Ehrman was just how much he was begging the question right from the get-go, and ignoring the fact that these are the issues that we have with the tradition that are on trial, and he's talking to us like these are established facts, when he's talking to an audience that knows better, that's not impressed with the Brothers of the Lord passage, and his laundry list of established facts is not that established.
Yeah.
I didn't like the fact either that he went after the Nazareth thing, just because that's such a non-issue. Whether there was a Jesus or not, whether there was a Nazareth or not, they don't really contribute anything to the question. I didn't like the fact that he kept going with the outer space, the Jesus in outer space analogy, as if that's just the most hilarious thing in the world. And I didn't like the fact that Robert Price answered that with Zoroastrian and Gnostic examples, when we've got perfectly good examples in Judaism and in Christianity. Even in the New Testament, we've got Jesus in space. We even have Paul in space in Paul. And so there was so much of it when they were just talking past each other like that. And again, the things he kept hammering at us was insisting that such and such is the case, that, he knew the brothers of the Lord, he knew the disciples, all these things that we've already called into question in the books that were brought up by Frank Zindler. And he just laughed that whole thing off as if, well, I don't agree with it, so I'm not going to waste my time with it. And it's like, then why are you here at all? And starting with a Trump-Hillary question, that sort of was set things off on a bad note too, I thought.
Yeah, he knew he could get that in.
Exactly. So it was these little digs and jabs that I was disappointed with him. I would love to see him actually debate the issues under question, not just talk to us as if they're established. And that was my biggest complaint. A Carrier Ehrman debate would be a lovely thing.
That's about the 100th time we've heard that.
Yeah.
Yeah, I agree.
It was the first thing I said.
Yeah. Richard, what were your thoughts?
Well, I wonder if there's a monetary value we can put to that and whether we could raise it. If we've had, I've heard that multiple times too, and you guys have heard it way more than me. And we know we have some people with money who are interested. I would just wonder if we did a general fundraising campaign. We would need to know what his number was. He'd have to actually commit to a number to get that to happen. But I wonder if that would be all it would take, right? I mean, there might be some other things like assurances that I'm not going to say fuck or whatever, but
or be mean to him,
or be mean to him. Yes, although he was kind of mean to Robert Price, so it's kind
wasn't
of
he?
He was meaner to Robert Price than I would have been to Bart Ehrman had I been up on the stage, and that's one of the things with. Ehrman's so afraid that I'm going to be indecorous or something because of the way I blog. But if he's looked at any of my debates, I'm a professional in debates, stage debates. I'm charitable to my opponents. I'm very calm. I just deal with the facts and arguments. I don't talk down to them. I don't laugh at them. So anyway, I think that's persuadable. I think that's a thing. Yeah, I kind of agree with all of the general sentiments everyone said so far. The Kristyn's idea, especially, although Ehrman finished with a Gish gallop of quite a large number, some 20 claims he made in the course of 2 minutes, he did waste a lot of time on arguments that weren't necessary. And the Nazareth one is one and Price never brought it up. He didn't bring it up in his opening, even though he came with the prepared opening and read his prepared opening, which I think was the biggest mistake Price made in the entire debate. But I'll talk about that in a moment. But so there are things like that where he wasted time on irrelevant arguments. But I understand why he did that, because he sees debate, I think, probably the same way I do, which is an educational opportunity. Now, I don't think he was terribly honest a lot in the debate. He made a lot of claims that are just outright false, and he knows they're false. And that disturbs me. I'm going to publish a blog where I actually catalog all of this stuff. But he also wants to educate people about don't make these bad arguments, please. And I think that the Nazareth argument is a bad argument for both of the reasons he gave. So I understand why he did that, even though it wasn't relevant to Price. And that was one case where he was honest enough to say that he was not imputing that argument to Price, that he was just saying, this is just a bad argument, I'll get out of the way. But at the same time, yeah, like David said, with the whole idea of mocking the things in outer space, no one can be buried in outer space. And he said, well, Paul himself says, unless you agree with Bryce that Galatians is a forgery, Paul himself says that he visited a garden in the third heaven. That's way up in outer space. What do you think? Do you think you can't bury someone in a garden? So it's these kinds of things that don't make sense. Even Price did not hit back with the ascension of Isaiah. He did not hit back with the passage in 1 Peter where the author of 1 Peter is pretty much admitting there are Christians who are saying that the historical Jesus is a myth. And then, of course, the author of the forger of that letter, I'm sorry, not 1 Peter, 2 Peter. The forger of that letter to Peter actually invents a historical meeting of Jesus to do that.
There were things mulling around in my head, and I'm certainly not anywhere near the level of expertise of either of you or Price or Ehrman. But I caught some of the things from Ehrman, but I found other things compelling. And then there were things that were just not discussed. And I was sitting here going, why? Why are we sacrificing question time? There's real issue.
Holy cow, yes. That was one of my biggest things. Well, basically, just from the general approach to debate, this debate format was a very advanced level debating format. This is one thing where I think this just was way above Price's head, because this is one of the most challenging to have opening statements and no rebuttals and no closing statements. so that you have to fashion cross-examinations and control the chaos of the cross-examination to get across your rebuttals and closing statements, that is probably the highest level of debate that there is. So I think that kind of did Price in. I don't think he has the skill for that. Like, even I could easily fail in that circumstance. I think it's an extremely challenging debate format. In fact, I'd probably not want that debate format. Although, knowing that I was going into that debate format, I would not have done what Price did. Price came like any other debate where you have podium time after podium time. He came with a written statement, ignored everything Bart Ehrman said, and just read his prepared statement.
Right.
Even though half the things Price was rebutting were things that Ehrman didn't rely on. He didn't rely on Josephus. Price burned a lot of clock time on Josephus. Price never referenced Josephus in the debate. That's just debate 101. You just don't burn clock time on arguments your opponent hasn't made. And that's a case there where what I would have done is knowing the debate format, I would have gone there without a prepared statement and just taken notes. And one thing I noticed by looking on stage is Price never took notes, and that's just disastrous.
Right.
You can't debate without taking notes, and so you can make sure you hit all the points that your opponent is saying. But no, I would have gone up there. I would have had a cue sheet of things that I think needed to get said, but I've also taken notes and made sure that when I got up there, first of all, I would have rebutted everything that Ehrman said, even if just with a straight assertion, a counter assertion for assertion. And then if I had time, I would have gone through my cue sheet. My cue sheet would be organized by priority. So I'd go down the list from top to bottom until I ran out of clock. And that way, by the end of my opening statement, every single thing Ehrman had said would at least have had one rebuttal on the record in the debate. And then the cross-examination would be sorting out between, we would have an even score by the end of the opening debate, or the opening statements. So then cross-examination would be, can we push that even score one way or another through our cross-examination, so that we're not even doing rebuttals and closing statements. We're actually just testing out what just happened, essentially. That's how that debate had to have been done. Price did not do it that way. And consequently, the number of claims and assertions and arguments that Ehrman made compared to rebuttals and claims and statements that Price made came out to a ratio of something like 20 to Ehrman. That's an absolute slaughter by any formal scoring of debate. And it's because when you look at it, I looked at things like all of the claims and arguments that Ehrman made. It's with Price, it's no score, no score, no score, no score, all the way down. Like he just didn't rebut hardly anything Ehrman said. And I think it was this format that threw him off, because you notice that he thought it was just a conversation. He's going to give a speech and then have a conversation. Consequently, there wasn't any debate going on from Price's side, really. He was just basically making some statements, most of which weren't relevant. And then on cross-examination, he took all kinds of bait that Ehrman threw at him, and got him to make arguments that are really super fringe, like that all the letters of Paul are forged and things like that. The Zoroastrian basis for the baptism of John is just so unnecessary. Even if you believe it, it's not even credible in my opinion, but even if you believe it, that is the worst position to take in a clocked debate. You just take the most defensible position, which is the position that is based on the most premises that your opponent already accepts. So you would go there and you'd say, like, you would build on the most mainstream premises that you can, and then say, look, even based on the mainstream peer-reviewed literature, I've got like half a dozen explanations for how the baptism of John story got invented. This is stuff in the mainstream peer-reviewed literature. This is not like wildly exaggerated Zoroastrian origin stories. This is stuff that's actually by Ehrman's peers, people who are actually writing from Oxford and stuff that he thinks is so impressive. So that's the thing, that it didn't happen in the debate. There just wasn't any proper rebuttal to this stuff. And then Price allowed Ehrman to basically goad him into defending the positions that made mythicism look ridiculous, but they're positions that aren't necessary for mythicism. And in fact, they're positions that I do not take or defend in my book on the historicity of Jesus. So in effect, Ehrman sort of manipulated this debate to essentially attack and to make his position look one way, and as if it's only standing up against this non-peer-reviewed fringe radical position. He did not position his arguments in the debate to be rebuttals to the only peer-reviewed version of non-historicity thesis that exists in his field, which is my book. Like there were a few digs in his thing that were like attacks on my book that were really crappy, like the whole mocking the outer space concept. But even though my book has tons of evidence of Jewish legends of Adam himself actually being buried in the third heaven in the garden where Paul visited. So Paul probably visited Adam's grave. But this is in the literature of the time. This is not crazy thinking. This is stuff we have precedents for. We have the model of Osiris, where it's exactly the same thing, where Osiris is put in history on earth, having this whole story. And then the priests admit that, no, that's all allegory. We only tell the public that. And we tell the initiates that actually he dies and rises in outer space. So that the whole thing happens in outer space. Exactly like what we're proposing for Christianity. So we actually have existing parallel models that exist at exactly the same time, where there's actual Jewish knowledge and influence going on. Because we have Alexandria and Judea. There's tons of pilgrimage between them. Alexandria had a huge Jewish community. So this idea that the way that Ehrman framed it is to making mythicism look ridiculous, he almost seemed to deliberately try to craft it that way. And even his opening well poisoning fallacy disturbed me in this, because it was kind of the same attitude of let's tell the audience before we even start this debate that Robert Price is going to vote for Donald Trump.
Yep.
And you're like, why the hell are you bringing that up? And he brought it up in the most visceral way, like having people raise hands and stuff like that. So that he's even using, motor sensory memory to like really viscerally call attention to this fact. So he's actually triggering emotions in the audience against his opponent. I mean, I find that really, really dishonest and kind of troublesome to me. So there are a lot of disturbing aspects of that.
Along those same lines that you were saying when bringing up Zoroastrianism, he purposefully mangled like Angra Mainyu and Ahriman, and like he was doing it on purpose to make it sound so ridiculous, as opposed to Josephus and Caiaphas and all those other words that you could also mangle and make them sound stupid too.
Right?
Yeah.
Like he doesn't
I was
know
also
Zoroastrian. It's ridiculous.
I was also really taken aback that he took a couple swings at Bayesian analysis, as if Bayesian analysis to blame for all this. Who's saying it? He was talking about Bayesian analysis the way creationists talk about carbon dating.
Well, it's funny that he uses the typical fallacy where he says, well, Swinburne used Bayes' theorem to prove the resurrection of Jesus. Therefore, Bayes' theorem is invalid. You can immediately respond like, well, William Lane Craig uses standard logic to prove that God exists with the Kalam. Therefore, standard logic is invalid and we shouldn't use it. It's like, that is the most ridiculously bad argument.
That's not what happened. No. What he said is, if Swinburne can use Bayesian analysis to prove Jesus' resurrection, and Carrier can use it to show that God didn't exist.
Yeah, he's equating
saying that a method that can lead to two mutually exclusive propositions is unreliable, which is the objection I have.
That's the same point I just made. That means that because William Lane Craig uses standard logic to get ridiculous conclusions, therefore standard logic is unreliable, and therefore we shouldn't use logic. I mean, the argument doesn't make any sense. He's comparing an abuse of a method with the correct use of them. A peer-reviewed use of the method, by the way, in his own field, that's actually accepted in his field, that he's equating that with a theologian's Christian apologetics. It's like saying that using this one Christian creationist used this as a particular method to prove that God created the universe and the evolution is false. Therefore, the same method used by evolutionists is invalid, and therefore we should reject evolution too. They're both absurd. I mean, that doesn't make any sense. It's like you have to look at it actually a valid use of a method. You can't use a ridiculous use of a method by someone who's not even a historian. That's another thing. Ehrman called Swinburne a historian, and that's a lie. Swinburne is not a historian. He has no degrees in history. He's a theologian. Right. So, and whereas we could talk about actual historians, we have, we have actual philosophers of history like C. Behan McCullough and Aviezer Tucker, who both talk about the use of Bayesian reasoning in history. And McCullough's objections to it are actually much more informed, and his objections to it are to replace it with the method that actually ends up reducing to it. So like he just wasn't aware of the logical reduction of one to the other. But the thing that was problematic, though, especially is because Ehrman used his first cross, and I think his first cross was really good. He asked really good questions. Like his first question out of the gate is, look, we don't have this cosmic Jesus gospel, but we have the historicity gospels. Why are you flipping it the other way around and going with what we don't have than what we do? And so there's all kinds of things you can say about that. The biased selection of evidence, the destruction of evidence, the massive amount of forgery that went on and things like that. But it's still a good argument. And he framed it in terms of probability. Well, let's talk about probability. This is all about probability theory. But the thing is, if you can't talk about probability, if you're going to reject probability theory, the very logic of probability, and you can't reject the logic, or you can't use the logic of probability and probability theory and talk about making decisions under certain conditions of uncertainty and not do it in a Bayesian way. I mean, any statistician, any philosophy expert on probability theory, any mathematician will tell you, if you're not using frequency statistics, your only option to resolve empirical questions in probability theory is Bayes' theorem. And you can't solve the historicity question with frequency statistics because we don't have data to do that with. So your only thing left is Bayes' theorem. So for Ehrman to actually say that you can't use Bayes' theorem to do history is literally saying you can't use probability theory to do history, while he's at the same time insisting that we should use probability theory to do history. The question is, well, if you're not using Bayes' theorem, what probability theory are you using? How are you determining your probabilities? What logical method are you deriving a probability from any premises? And that's the thing that Ehrman assiduously avoids ever answering this question. And this is an example where I think there are many instances of where in this debate, Price should have pushed him on his standard arguments. My biggest takeaway from this debate is that we learned nothing from this debate. No new statements were made in this debate. It was a waste of time in that respect.
There is one hang on for 2 seconds, Rick.
Okay, yeah.
Because there is one example where Price did come back and do some swings that I was proud of, and that's when he pushed back on Ehrman saying that mythicists invent these interpolations to whenever they come across something they don't like, oh, that's interpolated. And he points out very rightly, mythicists didn't invent this interpolation. This is accepted by all the scholars. Love that.
That was true. And then also he brought out in his opening statement that Ehrman does the same scholarship of convenience on the Josephine passage, which is a thing that would have been useful. He could have used that later in the debate, but he never did, to point out when Ehrman was digging on him for doing scholarship of convenience, he could have hit back and said, well, as I pointed out in my opening, you do the same thing. So why are you picking? How do you pick and choose when it's valid to do it? I mean, that would have been an interesting question to ask. Yeah.
One thing that I noticed that kind of went unanswered, and I'm wondering if anybody here has a rebuttal, the Caiaphas question. We don't have any good sources on Caiaphas, so why do we believe that he existed versus Jesus? Something that I hadn't really heard. A lot of the names get thrown out there, Caesar, all that kind of stuff, which are...
and you could pick even more obscure guys, too, probably. Tons of people mentioned in Josephus that are only mentioned in Josephus, for instance. I mean, I call this the argument from Spartacus, although there are two problems with these kinds of arguments. One is oftentimes they're wrong. For example, he says, Jesus is better attested than any other Palestinian Jew. It's false. We have Herod Agrippa. However, Ehrman was counting numbers, quote unquote, numbers of narrative accounts, even mythological narratives count for him somehow, but he's disregarding firsthand inscriptions commissioned by the person themselves. Now, there's no historian on earth with a PhD in history who would ever say that a bunch of a lifetime later mythological counts outweighs an inscription carved by the dude himself as attestation. So his playing around with what counts as evidence and the weight of evidence disturbed me as well. It's like he almost didn't care that there is such a thing as better and weaker evidence, that in fact having a mythological narrative about someone is not the same thing at all as having like hundreds of coins minted by him.
Can we point out the fact that he also kept calling the Gospels independent and multiple accounts, which made me want to tear my hair out each and every time he said that.
Yeah, and Price never called him out on that. That's another thing. That's really
after comparing mythicists to evangelicals constantly, and then uses their arguments.
That was messed up. But to answer your question about Caiaphas,
go ahead.
The problem with Caiaphas is not that we have better evidence for Caiaphas than we have for Jesus. The problem with Caiaphas is that he's not someone who is immediately worshipped as a celestial savior god, who is a pre-existent being created at the origin of the universe. Right. So we have in the earliest letters of Paul, the earliest evidence we have Paul talking about Jesus as this pre-existent archangel who's living in outer space, literally living in outer space, communicating with people through hidden messages in scripture and dreams and visions and stuff, and worshipped as a god. There is no other Palestinian Jew about whom that's the case. So it's the wrong reference class. If you want to look at the right reference class, let's talk about celestial savior gods that people say to communicate with them through visions and dreams and are pre-existent beings and whatnot. And you look in that reference class, there aren't a lot of historical people. Ehrman was playing around with reference classes in a very irrational and non-logical way. The problem with, and I say this in my article about Spartacus, because people often use Spartacus as an example, or recently did. And we actually do have better evidence for Spartacus than we have for Jesus. But even if we didn't, Spartacus is not in the same reference class. Spartacus is a military opponent of Rome that was fought in a war. He wasn't a worship savior deity right out of the gate. almost immediately in the earliest records that we have of him. So that's why we don't immediately doubt that. Now, if we had the kinds of things for Spartacus, like we look at the earliest references to Spartacus, and they all talk about the only way you know about him is through scripture and revelation, and that he's a worship savior deity living in outer space, communicating us from above, then we might start to doubt Spartacus, right? And so when you start actually looking at valid analogies, Ehrman's position starts to collapse. And I can't believe that Ehrman doesn't know this. It seems extremely unlikely that this isn't a deliberately crafted way to sort of conceal these problems with reference classing the person you're talking about.
And he did the same thing with the historicist case in general, just making it sound like this is airtight and established, and we're just bucking the consensus, as if there was a consensus to buck.
Yeah, I didn't mind that so much. I mean, that's fair. I mean, it's arrogant, but it's fair. Because that is the state of things. I mean, they are arrogant and the consensus is ridiculous, but it is what it is. It is the overwhelming consensus. But it's very similar in Q. You can be an asshole and do that on the Q hypothesis too, and go up there and say, it's overwhelming consensus, except there we at least have lots of peer-reviewed scholars saying, no, it's not. Not anymore, because we challenge it. On historicity, we're only just starting. Like, unlike Q, the Q hypothesis has had peer-reviewed literature challenging it for about 30 years or so. But this, we only since 2014 has there been any peer-reviewed challenge, any challenge that has met peer review and entered the peer-reviewed literature of the field, only just in 2014. So we got to wait and see like 10, 20, 30 years before we see how it pans out relative to the Q hypothesis, for example.
I've got a question for Matt. What would, as the only non-real mythicist, I think here, what counts for you as a historical Jesus? I mean, obviously, Ehrman is willing to cast away all of the miracles and even the resurrection account as whole out. What would it take to count as a historical Jesus for you? Say, if we could go in a time machine and figure out exactly what were the basis of the Gospels.
Well, that'd be interesting if we had a time machine. My thing is, and there's 2 points that I made in the video. One, I beat Ehrman up because when the Q&A started, I specifically asked a question. Basically, I asked Bob, why is this not taken seriously? Right. And he went with basically there's a big, credentialed cabal against us. And I directed the same question to Ehrman. And there's one and only right answer to the question I asked him. I asked him, what would it take for the mythicist position to be taken seriously in modern scholarship? And the only right answer is come up with better arguments and evidence. And instead, Ehrman said they need to get credentialed and they need to teach and they need to earn respect by posting these other things. And it was terrible. So I actually talked to him at the after dinner, and I explained to him why that question is god awful, and all it did was affirm what Bob had said, and that the correct answer, he made the question about the mythicists instead of about mythicism.
Right.
And I beat him up over this in the video I posted, but this ties into your question in the sense of, what would it take for me? I honestly don't care because here's the thing. I'm happy to say that I'm okay with the idea that Jesus existed. But I'm also happy pointing out that nobody can demonstrate to a reasonable certainty that he did in fact exist. This alone is not enough to convince me that it's a myth. It's like I'm applying skepticism in the same way I would to anything else. They haven't made their case for God. That doesn't mean that you automatically get to declare God exists and not have to provide a defense for it. They haven't made their case for the historicity of Jesus. And I'm fine with that. I don't need to go the extra step of saying, I'm therefore convinced that this is an invented myth, because that adopts a burden of proof that I'm not convinced we can necessarily meet. I've read David's book and Richard's books and Ehrman's book, and Ehrman was the least good of the bunch. But why would we adopt a burden of proof for something that automatically puts us on a fringe that we may not be meet, when all we need to do is say, you guys can't even demonstrate this guy existed, and you're willing to bet your life and your afterlife not only on that he existed as a person, but that we have an accurate record of his words and deeds, and that he was divine and he's the one true path to salvation. You haven't even made the first step on the journey, and you are taking this leap of faith to the end. And that is what I want to pound the drum on over and over forever. I don't want to, until there's a really, really strong 50-50 shot for mythicism being accepted as the new de facto standard.
Right.
I can't possibly back it, and it's not my field of expertise. So even if I was convinced that this was all a myth. And I certainly think that there are huge aspects of it that are clearly myth. I don't need to die on that hill as a non-expert when all I can I can just keep pointing out that they have the burden of proof.
Yeah, well, I'll say to that. I'm sorry, Dave. I'll let you go after this, but I'll just say to that point. And I understand, and we get this from a lot of atheists. And when we first started Mythicist Milwaukee, it really just having the ability and having just any kind of doubt to question Jesus as a historical character was just so fascinating for us, and it led us to understanding the mythology that surrounds it and all the problems that surround the story itself. Coming in as purely atheists, we had no idea. And just to kind of give you a small sample, we held this debate, and we've got really positive feedback from it. We'd love to do more types of events like this, and we're looking for feedback from you, especially Matt and those that are the atheists that don't care, because we do feel that there are even atheists that do find this interesting. But last year when I was in Kenya, I visited, there's one atheist group in Kenya. There's 13 million people in Kenya. And there's one atheist group, and they're small, but they're doing really great things. Harrison Mumia is doing fantastic things out there. But the first question, I was all scared meeting him, and I've told this story in the past, but because it's such a religious country, the first question, I said, "What are you guys working on?" I said, "What are you guys interested in?" And he had no idea who we were. And he said, "Our biggest question is, did Jesus exist?" And I was like, "Well, you came to the right place." And we ended up holding an international conference essentially with Robert Price, David Fitzgerald, and Richard Carrier. And the reason I bring that up is, this is a small group in Kenya. They're small, but they're really doing some good things. But it was really interesting to hear that was the first question out of their mouth. So I really think that there is an interest in this, and I may be wrong, obviously. I'm not right about everything, but there's an interest, and even being able to just ask the question, I think begs people to start taking less stock in that story.
I love the question, and that's one of the reasons why I was so eager to be the moderator.
Oh, we love having you.
I'm nitpicky about the question. And the question for me is there good reason to believe that Jesus existed? And to that, my answer is still probably not.
Right. And there's some people we won't move.
Phrased differently, how the question is phrased is important. And if it is this perception that you're trying to demonstrate that Jesus didn't exist, that you want to be able to answer the hard no or the strong atheist position, and you can't quite get there, I think all it does is, unfortunately, because I really want this to continue, and I think we need to keep investigating it, but it just gives ammunition to the ones that want to paint us as fringe.
For me, it's the answer to the pronouncement that Jesus was a good teacher. He had a lot of good things to say, and I don't know that we can say anything to that. I don't think so. I don't think.
Yeah. I did a verse by verse rebuttal for the Sermon on the Mount, whether you like it or not.
Yeah. Well, Hector Avalos's book, "Bad Jesus," is that's not the only one. I've seen some really good call out articles that point out, Jesus is actually kind of an asshole if you actually analyze the way the Gospels portray him. And then certainly, and I even noted way back when I wrote "Sense of Goodness Without God," is one of the things that actually led to me thinking, Christianity has nothing to offer me, is that Jesus says nothing whatsoever about democracy, civil rights, or human rights. The basic foundations of Western civilization in terms of our morality and our justice are completely absent from Jesus. He's not talking about, we need, we actually need democracy because this slavery thing, we can't have that. Any great wise man who can't condemn slavery is clearly not divine, right? So and people talk about, he was such a radical preacher and he got killed for what he taught. Now, if he got killed for being an abolitionist, you'd have a point. But he didn't.
And I kind of, the Gospels don't even agree why he was killed.
Well, yeah, I know, totally not. Not for taking a moral stand, not for taking a dangerous moral stand on something. Although,
it's funny you mentioned that, because Ehrman, one of his call outs on all the different secular Jesuses is that they don't make sense of Jesus' death. And the ironic thing is, his hypothetic Jesus doesn't make sense of Jesus' death either.
Yeah, I know, it doesn't.
It wasn't illegal to be a popular.
But I mean, to circle back to something that Matt said, I think where skeptics should really be interested in this, where this is really a proxy issue. The Q debate is another one that's more obscure that people don't know about, but it's a similar thing going on, where this illustrates a real serious problem within Jesus studies that is plaguing secular scholarship. And we're not talking about like the fundamentalists. We're not talking about the professors who are actually bound by contract to defend the positions. And we'll even deny that they are, but you can actually prove they are. David's new book is actually illustrates some of this. They're probably like, what is it, a third? Well, how many did you find, David, that were actually under their contracts required them to defend doctrine and they could not assert any free position?
Yeah, the numbers were astounding to me. It basically boiled down to somewhere between 2/3 and all of them.
Wait, no, it couldn't have been that high. Was it really 2/3?
Talking about religious institutions that require.
No. I meant just of scholars in general. Now, once we include seculars, at public universities and things, who are doing biblical studies. I can't remember if you did a stat on that, but
we did. We broke it down by non-religious institutions and religious institutions.
Yeah, but I think.
And the funny thing was how many religious institutions said, "Oh no, we don't have anything like a statement of faith." And then how many of them were found to have a statement of faith on there? Yes. And it's like, the question's not how many scholars publicly deny Jesus mythicism. It's how many of them are contractually obligated to.
Right. And that's the thing where we need to just not count them. Like you have to just admit, like, okay, those guys, their opinion is irrelevant because they are actually not even allowed to come to an honest conclusion about this. So they aren't like they've eliminated themselves from the academic debate. I mean that just discredits them outright.
Yeah, they may be correct, but we don't have to count them.
Yeah, right, exactly. They might have useful things to say, but yeah.
And not all of them feel that way. Secretly, what they feel is very different from what they say publicly.
That's also a problem too. But I'm saying just the secular scholars. Let's just look at the secular scholars who aren't under any of these obligations. Even they are subject to this bizarre rot, where you see things like Ehrman said, like basically what I call it is argument by prestige, where Ehrman's position was, well, I only believe prestigious people.
Right.
Where it's not like I only go where the evidence leads. No, it's not. If you're not prestigious enough, if you haven't been picked by Oxford, then I can't be swayed by anything you say. And this idea where evidence doesn't matter, and then where he's doing the exact same thing that Christian apologists do, where they're just making shit up and using fallacies to sort of rationalize the prestige position, rather than taking an honest, skeptical, evidential approach to the things. And so that's what people should have, like the thing that should offend people is something like historicity. If it's so certain, if it's so easily defensible, Ehrman should not need to lie 20 times in this debate.
Thank you.
Why
if the evidence is so overwhelming,
why does he say, for example, why did he say, and Eric Price never called him on this, why does he say that Paul says Jesus had disciples? No, Paul never uses the word disciple. Or he says Paul says that Jesus was a teacher and a preacher and preached in Palestine. No, Paul never says Jesus is a preacher. He never says he had a preaching ministry. He never says he preached, never calls him a teacher, never says he was a teacher. This is in the peer-reviewed literature. This is not just me saying this. Like Gerd Ludemann, I quote him asking the same point. Like, why does Paul never call Jesus a preacher? There are many cases, I'm going to document several, where Ehrman is just outright lying in the debate, just stone cold lying to the audience.
Yeah,
do that. Why does he need to do that? That's the more indicative thing. And this happens again and again and again in the field, where when you're dealing with people who are so certain mythicism is ridiculous and historicity has to be defended, and they're atheists or whatever, they either resort to lying or they resort to quoting people who are lying to them, and they don't know they're being lied to. And the question is, why are these secular historians lying to people? And that I think is the more disturbing thing that we need to fix. Like there needs to be serious reform in Jesus studies, where we need to say, let's get rid of this argument from prestige. Let's get rid of this a method of saying we have to rationalize the prestige position. And let's just go back to evidence-based reasoning, which is what the field should be based on. This is just the most obvious case where it's the most touchstone, most burning issue, where they get the most angry and therefore most reveal this flaw in their academics. That's what this issue does in a way that gets the attention of the public. And that's the worst thing for them, of course, is they don't like it when the public notices this. And this happens in the Q hypothesis argument too. Oh my God, the lies that come up in the Q argument. But this issue has gotten such attention from the public that they can't hide the lying anymore, where the lies get exposed. And this kind of pisses them off, which I think is partly why Ehrman doesn't want to debate me.
Right. Well, this is part of the passion that was missing in the debate, and we appreciate that.
I have the big bombshell that we heard from this debate, Kristyn.
Yeah.
So I have a question for you. What do you think the letters of Mrs. Ehrman, Bart Ehrman's mom, tell us about the historical Jesus?
Well, absolutely nothing. Just like, probably the rest of the Bible. So he was sitting there talking about his mother, and we can just assume that she understands everything, and she doesn't need to talk about everything. But getting back to Paul, that kind of brings back to my mind something that Earl Doherty was talking about. I've never had a satisfactory answer, and that was part of what I was talking about in the beginning, why I was hoping we could keep it a little more to the Doherty thesis. Is this has always been a big problem since I read about this in his books. And it kind of goes back to an old professor I had many years ago. He was opened up. I took a class in the Holocaust, and he opened up the class talking about how he got literature from Jews for Jesus. And he shook his head and he said, that's an oxymoron. When is a Jew for Jesus not an oxymoron? Because it's such a theologically jarring issue for the Jewish people to associate, a human being with God. So he's never satisfactorily answered that for me. What all of a sudden made this sect of Jews, or what made them just suddenly throw that out the window and accept recently deceased human being as God? That's such a big problem in Judaism. So that's something I'd like to have, addressed in the future, because I don't think I've ever gotten a good answer to that.
He tries to address it in how Jesus became God. He makes a lot of good points there that might be helpful for understanding that, to the point where he does correctly show that there actually wasn't a contradiction between the idea that the Christians originally had, which is that God had bestowed a sort of subordinate divine status upon Jesus, assigned him his powers and ascended him to high rank in the heavens and stuff like that, so that he's sort of God, but he's not really coterminous with God. The idea of him being identical with God was a much later idea. It wasn't original to Christianity. So the concept makes sense within Judaism, within certainly especially fringe countercultural Jewish sects. But in the book, he still doesn't explain the transition. Like, we get it that you've explained that it's plausible.
Yeah.
But you still haven't explained how it happened. Like, what did Jesus do? And especially because it had to be something so freaking amazing. How did no one notice it? That's the thing that they're trying to argue simultaneously. There was a total nobody that nobody noticed, and yet did and said such amazing things that they turned him into a god instantly.
Yes.
Right. Like this is a problem. And that for me, that has not been adequately explained by
and yet nobody outside his cult noticed anything he did or said. Right.
Yeah, that's my point actually. But yes.
Yeah, I like that Paul has the exact same understanding of Jesus that Bart Ehrman does. That was my favorite part.
Well, Matt has a couple questions for David and Richard, and then Kristyn obviously pop in there because we know how well studied you are. So take it away, Matt.
So one of the things that came up that I thought was a good take on this point, although I've heard others, that I'd like some thoughts on, is about the passage from Paul referring to James, the brother of the Lord.
Mm-hmm. What about it?
Well, Ehrman talked about the language there and how if he was using that as sort of a fraternal or religious brother rather than a familial one, then it would apply to both Cephas and James.
Oh, right.
And that this distinction of saying I met with Cephas and James, the brother of the Lord, is best read as a familial representation.
Right. Well, first of all, Paul, Ehrman sort of elided the fact that the only reason in Christianity that you were brothers of each other is that you were brothers of Jesus. You became the adopted sons of God through baptism. So there were actually unbaptized Christians too. So there's Christians in the movement that haven't been initiated through baptism. You didn't get baptized right away. Like this wasn't like modern evangelicalism where you just join the religion and immediately get baptized. You join as a sort of a applicant, and then eventually you go through the ritual and get baptized. And then that made you an adopted son of God.
That's so weird.
What's that?
Almost as if it was a mystery faith. That's so weird.
Well, yes, exactly. And Paul says this explicitly, that Jesus is the firstborn of many brethren. So it's very clear. We know from Paul that Paul understood brother of the Lord would mean all baptized Christians. So if he was going to use that phrase to refer to some other kind of brother of the Lord, someone who's not a cultic brother, but actually a biological brother, he would need to distinguish that. He would need to say brothers of the Lord in the flesh or something like that. But the fact that Paul has no knowledge or no awareness that he needs to make the distinction between two different kinds of brothers of the Lord, that's the first problem. The second problem is we have in the peer-reviewed literature, and this is a thing that gets ignored a lot, and I cited it in my book, Trudinger has published this, where he points out that the grammar of that passage in 1 Galatians actually says that James is not an apostle. The way the grammar is structured, that passage does not make James an apostle, even though most translations translate it as James is another apostle. No, in fact, Paul's actually saying there, I met no apostles except Peter, the Kephas. That's the only apostle he met. But I also met another brother of the Lord. I met a brother of the Lord, which is, or the brother of the Lord, James, which he means he's just saying, I met another baptized Christian. So whenever he uses brothers of the Lord, he only uses it twice in his letters. Both times he's making a distinction. And Ehrman was right about this. He's using it to draw a contrast between apostolic Christians and non-apostolic Christians. He's trying to make a contrast between, and also he doesn't want to imply that James is the brother of Peter, but he means specifically James is this other Christian. And I think brothers of the Lord was actually the original name for Christians. He's like, I met the Christian James, but the word Christian hadn't been invented yet. I think they were calling each other brothers of the Lord. That was the name of the sect at this time.
So how easy this is? You see how easy this is? Because this was what, sitting there listening, and with my understanding of it, this was one of the stronger arguments for Ehrman, and it
is in general the strongest argument for historicity, and you're right. So go on.
Though he ignores the fact that in just a few verses later, Paul's treating these guys as though they're losers and fake Christians, and these are supposed to be his disciples and relatives.
Well, that may get to my second question, but thanks, Richard, because while I'm, you've pulled me back slightly closer to middle.
We need to take another survey.
Yeah.
Right.
Should have been explained better during the debate, and it just left there hanging.
Yeah.
So the second question, and I may be making some fallacious assumptions here. So Paul, we are convinced that Paul existed, wrote his epistles, and interacted with apostles. They argued about things and posted those disagreements. Is that all correct?
I don't know what you mean by posted those disagreements.
Well, they wrote about.
Posted. The letters, wrote him letters and stuff. Yes, basically, sort of. Yeah.
But what Paul calls apostles are not what we call apostles today. And that should be pointed out as well.
Yeah. Well, Paul says anyone who's quote unquote seen the Lord, and then in Galatians 1 he says, seeing the Lord means revelation, is an apostle. Basically, what it means Jesus has appeared to you and assigned you to be a messenger for him.
Which could have been anyone.
Apostle means his messenger.
Sure, but
but anyway, go on.
The question that here is, so they disagreed on circumcision and they argued about stuff and it got recorded.
Mm-hmm.
If it were the case that Paul and these apostles had dramatically different views as to whether or not Jesus was a historical flesh and blood figure, isn't that something that would have likely been recorded as well?
Absolutely. When Paul in Galatians, Paul says, well, the only thing we really disagreed on is the circumcision thing, which was a proxy for other, like the dietary laws and stuff. Because basically Paul was saying we no longer have to be kosher, or specifically the Gentiles who join don't have to be kosher. Originally, Kephas and James and guys, when they were converting people to Christianity who weren't Jews, they were converting people first to Judaism. You had to actually become a Jew, then you became a Christian, which meant circumcision, dietary laws, and things like that. And Paul's saying, well, no. Let's not put that requirement on the Gentiles. We can induct the Gentiles because really, if you think of the logic of our own theology that you accept, Jesus died for everything. So since he's the ultimate atonement sacrifice, we don't really have to be kosher. And he didn't go that far. I don't think he ever said that the Jews could abandon the kosher thing. I mean, he waffles on that. Actually, Paul waffles on that explicitly, where he says sometimes he's one way, sometimes the other. But his argument to them in Galatians was that Gentiles don't. And this is a brilliant marketing idea, right? If you want to massively expand the church and bring in rake in money, all you have to do is tell the Gentiles you want to convert that they don't have to cut off a piece of their penis. This is the most brilliant marketing move ever for Christianity could ever have made. And so, I think also that's why they eventually said, yeah, let's go ahead and do that, because and that you see in the letters of Paul, he's talking about, he's collecting money from these churches and he's bringing it back to these guys in Jerusalem. So he's raking in dough for them. So he's saying, well, they probably did the math and go, yeah, okay, Gentiles, they don't need to circumcise themselves. That's all right. Keep bringing in the cash. We'll let that go. But it's very clear that wasn't the original teaching of the church. And Paul's claiming that Jesus came to him in a vision and said, I changed my mind about this. Gentiles don't have to be kosher. And so that's what's going on in there. But that does mean that they must agree on a lot of other things. That means they must agree on the Eucharist ritual. They must agree on the atonement role of Jesus' sacrifice and things like that.
Yeah, this is one of the reasons why it's so confusing, because if they must be in agreement, then we either have a primacy of Paul, in which case the apostles he met with had a similar non-historical figure view, or we're in conflict. But the fact that Paul can just invent doctrine certainly seems to support the idea that he didn't view Jesus as a teacher who actually said things and did things.
Oh, I see what you mean. I can play devil's advocate on that and defend the historicity position. I agree with you, actually. The logic there, it makes more sense that it was a visionary cult and not something established by an actual historical founder, which is why the historical founder thing became so popular in the 2nd century, because it was easier to control doctrine by saying that your dudes had a pedigree going back to the historical Jesus. That shut down every Joe Blow that could walk in and says, well, Jesus appeared to me. So, nope, do you have a pedigree? Even though we invented our pedigree, do you have a pedigree? And we know you don't, because we invented the pedigree. So we know if you claim to be part of it, you're not, because we made it up.
And that's also how they defended their gospels as well.
Yeah.
Oh,
so
you've got the Gospel of Mark. Well, I've got the Gospel of Matthew. And
so that's why historical Jesus became rhetorically valuable in the propaganda.
It didn't stop
It didn't. No, it didn't. It didn't stop it. But it allowed them to.
I'm really Paul writing you this, even though I'm not.
That's the next. that was the escalation in the arms race of trying to control the church with bullshit. But Yeah. So that, but in the beginning, and you see that with Paul saying, "I'm the last one," right? I think there was an attempt there to say, "Okay, we're having too many of these guys showing up saying that Jesus appeared to them, and it's causing problems." And they had others, like there's Apollos and these others that Paul talks about that suddenly disappear in the Gospels, right? That aren't part of the so-called 12 or whatever. But so yes, this was a problem. But the historicist would say that, well, okay, but they also really believed that the visionary Jesus that appeared to people was real too after his death. So some other Joe Blow could, like the risen Jesus could appear to him, like it's possible, and give him new instructions. I mean, I'm really struggling to make this sound like it makes sense, but
it sounds like you're.
This is the historicist's point of view on this. But yeah, you're right. It's really challenging to explain Paul at all when they could just say, you don't have a pedigree, right?
Yeah.
So that's and that never comes up. That's another thing that historicists, and I have to say, like I've talked about lying, but there's also historicists, actual experts in the field, that don't know what they're saying is false. And this happened with Mark Whitaker when I debated him on this issue on London radio a while back. And Mark Whitaker kept saying, Paul says that he learned the gospel from those who were in Christ before him. And I says, no, he doesn't. He explicitly denies that, and like repeatedly. Yeah. He doesn't say that. And he kept saying, no, he says that. And I says, no, he doesn't. No, it's a passage in the epistles. No, it's not. And so we went to commercial, and then he looked, and he came back and says, shit, it's not in there. And this is a really like super skilled, knowledgeable expert in the field, professor, the whole thing. Like this guy's no slouch. He's not some hack. And yet he had just kept people when he was being trained up in the field, people just kept repeating this to him. He just assumed it was true. He never checked. He never went to the epistles and looked and said, wait a minute, what you're telling me isn't even in here. And so we have that problem in the field as well, which goes back to what I was saying earlier about there's serious rot in the field of Jesus studies that needs to be fixed.
Well, there was one question that I had, which I will save for some other time, because I don't think it actually gets to mythicism, but there's a question here that I think kind of puts a bow on it, and I will apologize for it in advance. The background for this is early on, after my escape from Christianity, I came upon mythicist positions, specifically from Acharya S. Okay. And it seemed bizarre to me. And so I sent an email to Bob Price, and there was an exchange. And this was at a time when he'd written scathing reviews of her work and viewed her as literally, he said, she's never met a conspiracy theory she didn't like. I know they became friends, and her scholarship evidently improved. And I don't bear anybody any, but there are others. And so the question I have is, which mythicists should we listen to, and which are unscholarly conspiracy theorists with an agenda, and why should we take your word for it?
Matt, you need to be reading my next book.
Well, David, I read all your books, and I will definitely read them.
That's why I love you, Matt.
I mean, honestly, that's what peer review is for, and that's why I work to get my book through peer review. I wish Price had tried to do that. I wish Doherty had done, because Doherty was really close. Like, he almost had a peer review passing book. It would have taken more work for him to get it through peer review, but he could have if he'd worked at it. Because it was really close to being dissertation quality, his book. Like, it just needed some fixing. Like, if he'd gone through a PhD program My critique of his book, which I put up online a while ago, I approached it literally as if I was his dissertation advisor, and I said, "If you fix these things, this is a passable dissertation."
This is the Jesus puzzle,
and I mean that.
Just to clarify,
this is the original book, the first one, the Jesus puzzle.
Yeah. Okay.
So he was really close, and he's the one where I do think he does fall into, seeing rabbits everywhere when he's looking for rabbits kind of thing. But so he does have that problem, but he's not one of these crazy conspiracy theorists. He takes evidence seriously. And that was the thing that really got me on this track, is like, he was the first one I'd read where I said, wow, this guy actually cares about evidence. He's done his research. He knows what he's talking about. He's not making shit up. He's not confusing. This is the big one. He's not confusing speculation with fact. Like, he very clearly says, this is a fact. This is what I infer from it. This is why I infer that from that fact, which we don't get from like Akaria S or Freakin' Gandhi or Atwill, where they're just like full on bonkers, believe any weird shit that they come up in their heads, and it's fact suddenly, even though it's really just a mountain of speculations.
Don't get me started on Atwill.
Yeah, well, Atwill's the crazy. I mean, I think he's literally crazy. Like, I don't.
Every week he comes up with a new proof that we found a letter that shows that Jesus was invented by the Pope and the Masons.
Yes, I know. He has tons of money. He randomly fell ass backwards into money during the 90s, I think, stock market. And so he actually spends a lot of money on promoting his views. That's why. And I constantly get emails and messages like, hey, look, this guy says he found proof that Jesus didn't exist. And we're like, no, that's the same press release he's been circulating for 20 years.
Yeah, and I guess my challenge to all of that, and it's no secret that we came upon this information because of DM Murdoch, Acharya S, and unfortunately, she passed away last year on Christmas, and she definitely needed a PR person, and I told her that because she really did have some issues dealing with the public and holding grudges and things like that. But outside of that.
And she also really needed to clean up she could just clean up the distinction between fact and speculation.
Right. But
like, and then she actually could have gone on to get a PhD, I think, and actually been like, and there's like Margaret Barker is an example. Margaret Barker's like the Akaria S, the Dorothy Murdoch who actually went and got the PhD and realized there's a difference between speculation and fact. Where Margaret Barker, like her books, like about 90% of what she writes, I think, is not true. Not true in terms of the conclusions, I think, but all her facts are correct, and like her reasoning is pretty good and stuff. So she's super erudite. Like Margaret Barker has written like amazingly detailed treatises on how Christianity relates to Jewish temple cult and stuff. And it's just really fascinating stuff. Yeah, so she could have become Margaret Barker, I think. Well, she just needed to learn that demarcation and say, okay, so like half the things I'm saying are like, I really can't, like, they're speculative. They could be true, but I don't have evidence for it. Right. But here's the stuff I have evidence for. Isn't that weird?
Right. Well,
if she'd just done that, she could have done amazing things. Right. And she got better and better at doing that over time.
Agreed. But I guess the bigger point that I was making was I understand that people disagree with Atwell, people disagree with Acharya, people disagree with Carrier, Fitzgerald, and Price. The one thing that's nice, and this is what we try to do because we're not scholars, we're laymen, and Kristyn actually, out of all of us, is definitely the scholar. But
awesome.
The non-ass clown.
That's what Rob said. I don't know, but I mean, but the
my
point,
people.
I totally missed that.
Right.
You apparently know more shit about this than anybody. Any other guys, any other Mythicist gang.
Absolutely. And but I think what these
never enough though.
What these people are doing is at least they're getting arguments out there to get people interested in, and then they come across the arguments that, like you had said, Carrier, past peer review, and then you start, I mean, for us, we started with DM, we ended up on you, Fitzgerald. Being skeptics and being atheists, like I think Matt points this out perfectly, is that we don't just hear one thing and like that's it. That's it for the most part. Now there are people out there that do that. I get it, but popularizing it, I think that's in our best interest is to.
I agree that there's utility there. The problem, let me give you an example of the one problem with that is, and this is because of Dorothy Murdoch's work. When in Religulous, Bill Maher has that bit
about
the non-existence of Jesus, and basically like half of the facts he throws up on the screen are false.
Cites Horace, right?
It just destroys things because that was hugely popular. Lots of people see that.
Yeah.
And now they say, "Oh, that's what mythicism is." Look,
Right.
I could refute that for 5 minutes on Google,
Right.
and like, no, god damn it! And so that creates enormous problems for me in terms of gaining credibility for the idea and being taken seriously. Whereas if he had just talked to someone like Earl Doherty or me or someone like that who could set him straight and say, "Oh no, wait. If you just shift some things, there are facts that support what you want to do.
Right.
That you're just not using the right ones." Then we could have had something amazing. Then it could have had a really impressive impact. And I think like the God Who Wasn't There came the closest to getting things right.
Right.
That's because they talked to Price.
Oh, I say
right?
you were in the movie too, right?
Fleming talked. Oh, they talked to me too, but they talked to Price. And so they weren't throwing up the Horace, the zeitgeist garbage.
Well, but again, I hate to jump on this bandwagon too, but coming in as a layman, not knowing anything about this, one of the biggest things that really interested us to the point of me traveling to Egypt and Greece was just knowing that these older religions existed and that there were similar stories, and that the parallelism gets played down a lot. But when you're coming in and obviously we're all nerds here and we like the subject and we love hearing, a 3-hour debate between Price and Ehrman. There are people out there that want that, quick and then it may interest them like it did to us to do further research. And I think that there is something to be said there, and there's something to be said to you guys are always bringing up other Jesuses that exist through scholars. Scholars all have their own version of Jesus, and a lot of times that mirrors their own personal thoughts and things like that. I kind of see that analogous to mythicism, where there is a right way to do it and there's a wrong way to do it. I get it, but you're going to have varying opinions, and at least if we're getting people interested in the field, that definitely helps all of us.
What he means to say is look for Batman and Jesus coming in 2000.
Exactly.
Shameless plug there, Jason. I love it. But I don't know. That's just my
qualified
personal...
scholars.
Yeah.
Pretty much I agree with everything that everybody had to say. I think there was a lot of missed opportunities by Dr. Price, and I do think there's a lot of diversions on Bart Ehrman's part. But overall, I was glad to see some civil discourse, and I hope that's the main thing that we took out of this. That some of the scholars are maybe possibly slightly more open towards talking about this with mythicist scholars and other mythicists in the future. We've sat down and we've proved that two people can sit down and talk about this topic civilly, and we can maybe have some beers, and it doesn't have to be so polemical maybe in the future. So I think if we at least can start changing the tone and the attitudes that people are taking toward each other, then maybe we can make some progress. And I think we did a little bit of that.
Yeah. Wow, it's hard though when someone's constantly lying.
Right.
Yes. Well,
it's going to happen. It's just unfortunate. So, Kristyn, do you think this furthered the conversation, and you're more positive about?
Here's the other thing I take out of this is that the people that are lying and getting away with it are now getting called out on that. Maybe not on a huge level, but it's happening now. They, they're not getting away with as much as they used to, maybe.
Oh, I agree. Yeah.
Matt, do you have any final thoughts?
Yeah, I don't have a lot to add because I left the day after and went and did a talk in Wichita, which gave my thoughts on the debate at the time. And I'm not completely happy with it because I was meandering. It wasn't anywhere near the best talk, but I'm happy with what I said. And I hit Bob for debate performance, and I hit Bart for his answer to my question, and then doubling down on it afterwards. Despite the fact that I'm not a mythicist, I love the conversation, and I was contacted by my friend at the Bible and Beer Consortium, and they want to do a debate on mythicism in February in Houston. And the first 5 minutes after he told me he wanted to do this, I sent a message to Richard to say, hey, do you have anybody you'd recommend, or could you possibly do it? Because I want to see more of these so that we can get a better feel for where we are. And I say we, and where we need to be going. And I don't think we got much of that in this particular debate, but I'm still glad it happened, even though I'd almost bet money that Ehrman never agrees to debate this again. I bet he doesn't even put a dollar amount on it. But there are others that might, and I'd like to see Richard, David, any number of people who I respect and who are good at explaining things.
Yes.
Get up there and do that. When Kara talked about what, taking notes during the debate and how you work these, I want all of my debates to move away from the joint press conference and be more conversational. And we actually had almost a signed deal with William Lane Craig for the two of us just to sit in a chair with an unstructured conversation for an hour in Vancouver. And he backed out, and they're putting Dinesh in his place.
Yeah.
And I don't think that conversation is going to be nearly as good. But that back and forth not only lets you see how people think, but what they're thinking about. It shows you who has got just the talking points and who has an understanding of it. And when that isn't utilized, I think debates suffer. Because we're not doing this for points in a collegiate scored debate. We're doing it to educate people and hopefully move the conversation forward. So I'm really glad that Mythicist Milwaukee put this on. I'm happy that it happened, but I'm looking for more and better next time.
Yeah, let me give an example of that. I debated Mike Licona twice, and I like both debates, but my favorite of the two was actually the second one, where even though there was sort of the combative podium statements at the beginning, the rest of it was a cross-examination. It was similar to this, but there was longer cross-exam time. But the goal of the debate, the stated goal of the debate, and we both took it seriously, and Mike Licona is like an honest man, so he took it seriously. That's kind of key. You both have to take this point seriously, which is, okay, the goal of this debate, and you state this, and you get both sides to commit to this before you go in and say, the goal of this debate is for each of you to understand why the other one holds the belief that they do. So rather than this is a battle to try and convince and sway the audience, it's, I want to understand why you think what you do. And if you both commit to that goal and have your conversation, you switch over like who controls the conversation, and you let that run, you can find out a lot of really interesting things, and it goes in a much more interesting direction. It's much more collegial. It's much more fun to watch. There were a lot of people who hated that debate because they came wanting to watch one or the other of us beat up the other. So some people, they come to debates wanting to see an annihilation. They want to see WWE wrestling or whatever. But I think if you can get people to realize that the value of just having that goal, of having these two intelligent people who really know their shit ask each other and try to find out between each other why they believe what they believe, you make more progress on any issue. I don't care what the topic is that the debate is about. I like that model of debate. I'd like to see that done. But you have to prepare it that way. It has to be like both the debate opponents going in have to know that that's what the goal is of the debate, and they have to be committed to actually doing it.
Yeah, and we appreciate you saying that too, Matt. That was really nice. And yeah, we do want to see more of these. And I guess I guess I will challenge you a little bit.
Tell the Bible Beer Consortium to get their own shtick.
I guess I would challenge you on that original point that you had said it's not ready for the main stage, but you want to see it to continue. I guess what would make it to where it's it's ready for the big stage? And do you see the Bible Belt Consortium interest in it, or whatever it is? BBC. Sorry, BBC. They are our competitors, I'm just kidding. But yeah, having the BBC interested, is that a sign that this may start growing?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, it would be really easy to say, oh, well, we just need a little bit more evidence or a couple better arguments. And I'm not necessarily sure that that's the case. I think what needs to happen is the current case needs to be presented in a way that is enlightening and intriguing to people in general, and to the scholars who have disregarded it specifically, even if there is nothing additional. Having a hard-hitting, reasonable case that doesn't smell like it came from the tinfoil hat factory, and that we may be at a point where mythicism is in fact ready for prime time, but hasn't had the representation that it needs to show that to everybody. Because I want Ehrman to get off of this, Carrier would be taken so much more seriously if he was, teaching and would publish on things other than this. And, he's probably doing him, that's about the person, and that's about the insiders club.
Right.
And that is exactly what even the conspiracy theorists, when we listen to creationists, it's, there's a conspiracy in science that they just won't let our ideas see the light of day. That's not the case. Your ideas are demonstrably awful, and you have nothing to back them up with. In the case of mythicism, that's not necessarily the case. And I would like to see something that bridges the gap between soft mythicism and hard mythicism, so that people can say, look, at a minimum, they can't demonstrate that he existed, but we may have really good reason to go a bit further and talk about what is reasonable as far as a fictional invention. If we remove all the things from, here's a list of everything about Jesus's life that we know from the Gospels and from any other writings in the New Testament. Let's remove everything that's clearly BS and mythic. And what are we left with? What can we really say about this person? And is it that ridiculous to say that once we've stripped this down to, hey, at best, we might have an itinerant rabbi in the first century named Yeshua? Big deal. How does that tie to the person that everybody banks their salvation?
And that's what my question earlier with
Matt,
the time
that questioning
Right.
is exactly what made me become a mythicist.
And that's, if we can get people to that point, that's a success. And that's, that's as far as our organization, that is a success. And David?
Yeah.
I agree with everything Matt was just saying. And at the end of the day, this isn't about mythicists versus historicists. It's about people who take mythicism seriously and those that reject it out of hand. And the ironic thing about Bart is that in so many ways, the arguments he's giving us, he's spent so much time showing that the Gospels aren't reliable in so many ways that he's still one of the best mythicist writers out there and always will be, whether he does another debate or not. I love what Price said. He's sitting on a branch that he sawed off long ago. And it seems like from starting with did Jesus exist to how Jesus became God, with each new book, you can see how facts that he thought were really well established in book 1, he back away from just ever so slightly in book 2 and slightly again on book 3. And so I'm waiting for the book he comes out in, 5 or 6 years. That's going to be an awesome book.
Right. Right.
Yeah, one thing I didn't get a chance to ask him, I really wish I could have, was what part of the crucifixion does he believe is historically accurate? Is it Barabbas? Is it that they actually crucified him when that really wasn't the punishment for the crime that he would have apparently committed? Like, everything about that story just seems wrong.
Right. And Kurt Knoll is just one of the historians who's pointing out that we don't need anything in Jesus' life to explain the rise of Christianity. We just need to have a group of early Christians who were preaching these things, who just believed it, or were told it and then believed it.
Okay, it's like Roswell UFO cults, right? It's the same kind of thing.
Right.
Like, Kristyn,
I actually have.
what is your take on everything that's just happened? We've talked about.
No, I really enjoyed the conversation. I graduated from a Christian college, and I grew up in evangelical Christianity.
Wow.
And this gives me a chance to talk about that. There's a kind of the underlying assumption and the accusation that mythicists are atheists with, this agenda coming in that, they can't have Jesus exist.
Right.
I hear that a lot from the evangelical side.
Oh, yeah.
In my case, that's not true. I would have been, actually, before I started reading your books and David's books and some of the, the other mythicists like Doherty, I would have called myself, I was a Christian. I would have been more of a, more along the lines of like James McGrath or John Shore, So I was more of a liberal at that point. I'd kind of worked to that point. So for the people that are out there that think it's part of the atheist agenda, it's not. There are Christians that are being affected by this, and you're changing minds. There's something to take from that you're not just affecting atheists and changing their minds. There's actually progressive Christians out there that are hearing this, and maybe they don't go all the way to mythicism like I did, but they are, maybe considering some of these things. So, and that's another thing I hope the debate kind of opens up conversations that opens up for people. So that's something I'm glad to be able to let you all know that you are, your people are reading your stuff, and maybe people that you wouldn't expect, and they are considering mythicism.
Yeah. And in terms of like ancillary effects, that's a good point too, because I've met lots of people who've read my book, don't agree or necessarily with the conclusion, but found all the data in it really fascinating, and especially like my chapter on the Gospels, pointing out how it's all literary allegory. And I've met a few Christians who say I don't necessarily need the Gospels to be historically true anymore, because when you look at the analysis of what the point of the stories was, it's like, oh yeah, I find like these deeply moral stories, they don't need to be true. don't need to be historically true because they're like morally true in a sense. And so, yes, studying mythicism can actually benefit a Christian in terms of actually really understanding their texts better,
right?
Rather than rationalizing a doctrine that they're supposed to believe. Now, what I think in reality, ultimately, will lead you away from your faith as possible, but certainly you want to understand what the original intent of these authors was. What were they doing with the construction of these stories? And the only way to really understand that is to get away from your creed and your doctrine, which is modern stuff that's forced on you, and go back and do what the mythicists are doing, is really analyze what is the purpose of this story. Why did they construct it this way? And that's, I think, really a good takeaway that anybody can get out of this, regardless of whether you side with historicity or not.
Right. And we're going to the sources. If you're going to say anything about what Jesus said or did, who's telling you that? And asking that question cuts out a lot of blubber.
Yeah.
Yes.
Right. And religious people are technically mythicists to other religions. So,
And you're saying that the guy who never met Jesus, who only
that's
had
another good point.
A vision, is not reliable historical source.
And of course, you don't have to be a mythicist to be an atheist. I mean, it's not like Christianity is going to suddenly make sense if there had been a Jesus.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Exactly. Well, thank you again, guys. Thank you so much. This was great.
I think it shows that there's value in mythicism, no matter what your theological,
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
I agree.
Yeah, and I think the stats don't lie. We did get a lot of interest in this. Obviously, a lot of secular people, but who knows? Maybe we get some people on the fence. So thank you again so much for everything, guys, and we will be in touch in the future. We got some big things planned. Batman and Jesus is coming up, which both of you are in, David and Richard. So we're excited about that. We have some big announcements. Yeah, Jason's in it. Yeah.
Face.
Yeah, I'm in it too. Yeah, so we got some big announcements coming up. With that, if you like the Bart Ehrman, Robert Price debate, we got some big things on the horizon. So stay tuned to what we're doing, and we'll see you on our normal Sunday where we have Alana Turner, comedian.
The Sunday when they're not going to be able to listen to it.
The Sunday when they can't, when we're recording, right? Yeah. But Alana Turner coming on. She's a hilarious comedian, musician. So check that out, and then we'll talk to you soon. Thanks for joining us.
The Mythicist Milwaukee Show is brought to you by Mythicist Milwaukee. Producer Sean Fracek. Associate producer Melanie Lawson. Engineer Jason Lawson. Mythmeister Antonio Blandone. Researcher Kristyn Whitaker-Hood. Closing theme written and performed by Shelley Siegel. On behalf of co-host Brian Edward and the entire team, I'm Rob Moore reminding you to keep it safe and keep it secular.